Well, we already know that obesity is associated with many comorbid diseases, like all these you see there, and more. Well, there is a stage in the king criteria for this association that considers not only BMI, but also metabolic effects or multisystemic effects. So it takes into account not only the body mass index, which you see in the second line, but also other factors like body image, health perception, overall function, economic aspects, etc. So it's interesting to keep these stages in mind if you want to delve a little into the topic. Regarding the regulation of energy balance, I'm just going to say 2 words because otherwise we won't have time for everything we want to discuss. We have already talked a lot about white adipose tissue and brown adipose tissue. Academically, we have the concept of energy expenditure, including basal metabolic rate, which is metabolic rest expenditure, calculated using formulas or theoretically by indirect calorimetry, but usually with formulas. The food-induced thermogenesis, which is quite insignificant, so to speak. The thermal effect of exercise, which is indeed important, not just from exercise, but also daily activities, even at rest. You have a presentation with Walter Suarez and the exercise we do in our day-to-day lives when we are at rest. Food-induced thermogenesis, which is pretty unimportant, so to speak. The thermal effect of exercise is crucial. You have a presentation with Walter Suarez, an excellent course segment. Move your legs, do abdominal contractions while resting, and do passive contractions for abdominals and quadriceps, even if you have a sedentary job. Sitting up straight and contracting abdominal and quadriceps muscles can help. Every small effort counts. I often advise patients to move their legs, do abdominal contractions at rest, get up and perform. Passive contractions learned in rehab involving muscles from the abdomen to the quadriceps. This is part of the thermal effect of exercise. For those with sedentary jobs, this thermal expenditure might seem pointless, but sitting up straight and contracting abdominal and quadriceps muscles can help. When recommending ways to increase energy expenditure, every small addition to the deficit counts. Adaptive thermogenesis varies with caloric intake and relates to brown adipose tissue, which has limited ways to increase. And when a person doesn't have time because they have a very sedentary job, all of this thermal expenditure seems useless. But when you spend a lot of time sitting, I don't know if you've had the experience of sitting up straight and contracting both your abdominal and quadriceps muscles. Keep in mind that when you want to give someone a series of recommendations to increase energy expenditure, this effect, any little bit we add to the expenditure, to the deficit, to the second part of the equation counts. Adaptive thermogenesis varies with chronic caloric intake and is linked to brown adipose tissue, which has limited factors that can increase it. Cold exposure is one such factor. Although our understanding in daily practice is unclear, it's known that temperatures below 18 or 19 degrees can stimulate brown adipose tissue. If there is anything, it is the cold. If there is anything, it is the cold. And well, we also don't have a clear understanding in daily practice, but it's true that if we can choose in usual environments, we prefer a temperature below 18 or 19 degrees to stimulate that brown adipose tissue. There are people who, well, have invented things or therapies. Well, they had their thing, a kind of freezing chambers that lowered your temperature, and it is true that it seemed to increase. Well, without further ado, the fact is that adaptive thermogenesis is still very much under study. It's based on the theory of the famous brown adipose tissue, and it's very interesting. We're looking into it, but we haven't really grounded this in practice yet on how to use it beyond just trying to maintain a daily temperature that isn't entirely comfortable. If you want to ground it practically in some way, what doesn't feel entirely comfortable means, without getting a cold, is that it should stimulate you to move a little bit in some way, to dissipate that energy Energy expenditure and physical activity are key topics, but Walter will cover them. Obesity today is linked to our genes evolving slower than lifestyle and eating habits. Easy access to high-calorie foods, sedentary behavior, and stress contribute to obesity. These factors, along with obesogens and dietary changes, are central to the obesity pandemic. Obesity today is largely due to our genes evolving slower than our lifestyle and eating habits. We have easy access to high-calorie foods and sedentary behavior, combined with stress and elevated cortisol levels, which are factors related to obesogens and microbiota changes due to diet. Adipose tissue produces hormones like leptin, and obese individuals resist leptin and have decreased hyponeptin, impacting cardiovascular health. So today we have too easy access to all the pleasurable contributions of high-calorie foods and sedentary behavior combined with stress, meaning sedentary lifestyle plus stress plus elevated cortisol levels plus easier access to food are probably more factors that could be related, as we will see, to obesogens and the whole issue of changes in the microbiota due to dietary changes, which I will comment on for about 5 minutes. This is the cause of the obesity pandemic or the syndemic we are experiencing. This type of slide I'm presenting is actually designed by laboratories in the industry that are developing pharmaceutical targets on areas of the brain that inhibit pleasure mechanisms related to food intake. It's good, it's good to explain physiologically that both adipose tissue, which we already know produces a series of hormones like leptin, which you know because we've seen it in the theoretical part, that obese individuals have peripheral and central hypothalamic resistance to leptin and a decrease in hyponeptin, which has protective effects at the cardiovascular level. We know that obese patients have insulin resistance, which means that insulin levels are high because it's not functioning properly. Insulin is a hormone produced by the pancreas, and we have other hormones produced in the intestines like GLP-1, which we've already talked about, ghrelin and cholecystokinin, which is primarily found in the intestines, etc., etc. All of this is transmitted through the bloodstream because they are hormones that travel through the blood to the hypothalamus and exert their action in controlling the impulses for intake and regulating metabolic expenditure. So the drugs or therapeutic targets that the pharmaceutical industry and laboratories always try to manufacture go along this path. They try to address the receptors of leptin, adiponectin, GLP-1, etc. This is all very well theoretically, but our approach, at least our approach in this course, doesn't go this way, even though it's good for us to know all the mechanisms and all the neurometabolic pathways. Well, this is what was being discussed, simply that everything is very well regulated, and I don't know of any drugs that have tried to address this that actually had an effect and helped people lose weight, but at the cost of side effects that, in my opinion, and not just my opinion, but also from authorities like the EMA or EMEA, have ultimately led to these drugs being withdrawn. So, controlling the prefrontal cortex, the dopaminergic system, the pleasure center, the contributions, etc. Let's say that not controlling it, at least not through a pharmaceutical approach, wasn't really the best option. In the end, 1,000. These were the central signals I was mentioning, and the peripheral signals are more related to GLP, as we said, and with other hormones like cholecystokinin that are in the stomach. Slendesta, a potato protein, stimulates cholecystokinin for satiety. Obesity involves many mechanisms. Addressing one, like historical collection, fails as you can't tackle just one for all patients. Well, in my experience, it doesn't produce that much satiety either, but the pathophysiological explanation was plausible. But as you will see, obesity has so many mechanisms that if we try, for example, to address only one, such as the historical collection, because if you stimulate it, satiety increases, you will fail no matter what, because you cannot address only one mechanism in all patients, because it is impossible. As you can see here, we're discussing intake and expenditure regulation. It explains why weight loss stops and reverses. Balance changes reveal a set point, making further loss difficult. But basically, this is interesting because it often explains why people lose weight up to a point and then stop losing weight and regain it. You see, when we alter the balance, there's a kind of set point, which is the point below which it's very difficult for people to lose weight due to everything that was mentioned. So what happens? What if we lose weight? Appetite increases because of all these factors and all these hormones and all these, the vagal nerve, all the peptides, etc. We lose weight, appetite increases, and metabolic expenditure decreases. So a person who loses weight decreases their metabolic expenditure and their appetite increases, which means the normal tendency is to eat more. You know, the typical person who diets for 15 days and then says, I'm tired of dieting, and eventually gets demotivated and goes back to eating, right? Poor things. I don't know what your regulation is. It's just the pathophysiology. So when people, if they don't do it in a certain way or with a certain support, I'll tell you what my way is, because probably the people who are listening to me, even those who are in the integrative health school, etc., everyone has their own way of doing things, but it's true that if you put a patient on a low-calorie diet, this happens. Their weight decreases in a completely physiological way. Appetite-stimulating hormones increase, and their metabolic expenditure decreases. So it's just a matter of a very short time before, if you don't provide some kind of tool, and we'll see what those could be for weight loss, they go back to eating. And on top of that, the poor thing thinks it's their fault because they get demotivated and feel incapable of sticking to the diet. And on the contrary, when we have overeating, body which is very well designed for these kinds of things decreases appetite and increases caloric expenditure. So if we weren't exposed to an obesogenic environment, our cortisol rises, and we have a high-calorie diet where quick foods like snacks are high in salt, fat, and carbohydrates, etc. But if it weren't, hyperphagia would reduce appetite and boost calorie burn. So this set point would work similarly for weight loss and overeating. But our society is, as mentioned, geared to more calories, less exercise, and also a hormonal imbalance involving cortisol and microbiota, with lipopolysaccharides and their endotoxemia, with the fiber deficit, with obesogens, etc. But if it weren't like that, overeating would normally decrease appetite and increase caloric expenditure. So this set point would work the same way when you try to lose weight as when you start eating more than you should. But our society is geared towards an increase in caloric intake, a decrease in exercise, and also a hormonal imbalance that involves not only cortisol, but also a lot with the microbiota, with lipopolysaccharides, with the endotoxemia of lipopolysaccharides, with the fiber deficit we're consuming, with obesogens, etc., etc. We're literally headed towards obesity if we don't do things differently, and that's it. But I just think this slide is important so that we don't blame endocrinologists. The truth is, they have traditionally done this a lot to patients, saying things like, it's because you're not following the diet, or you're just deceiving me, or it's really, no, poor things. No, it's just like this. When a person goes on a diet, even if they do it super, super strictly, if they continue with a series of bad habits, don't exercise, don't tone up, don't include enough protein, don't eliminate toxins, don't improve their whole fiber intake, and don't boost their Akkermansia levels, etc., it's just that they're going to hit a plateau. And on top of that, they're going to get frustrated, as the kids say, because they're doing everything perfectly and still not losing weight. But that's just how it is.